All right, friends, wanted to take a few minutes and answer tonight's burning question. Does RJ Barrett's contract extension kill a potential Jazz-Knicks deal? The answer is no, maybe not, but I wanted to talk about why. So Barrett just agreed to a 4-year, $120 million rookie contract extension. There's nothing that says he can't be traded right after signing that extension. However, there is some weird math that's going to come into play if Barrett is traded. If he's traded for Donovan Mitchell, for example, if he's traded for anybody else, really any trade between now and the end of next June has some weird trade math that is going to apply. So let's explain that. I'll start by saying I have no idea if the Jazz like RJ, if they want RJ, if they're okay paying RJ, if RJ's inclusion in a deal is an absolute condition to the deal getting done. I don't know any of that. I also don't know if the Knicks are fully done negotiating with the Jazz. I know that when Woj first tweeted this RJ Barrett contract news, he did so with what sounded to me like a degree of finality, like the Knicks had kind of given a deadline and they were okay pulling out of negotiations altogether. But then later he backtracked a little bit and made it sound like there might still be some room to get a deal done if they could solve some of the math things we're going to talk about here. So don't interpret this little video as any indication that I have any clue whether the Jazz are interested in the player in question, whether the Jazz and Knicks are still negotiating. But I'm just here to make some sense of how some of these things work. So tonight you've undoubtedly heard the phrase poison pill. And I'm going to try to make some sense of that term in the context of a few different trade constructs. And I'll do that for you right now. So despite just agreeing to this extension on Monday night, RJ Barrett is eligible for trade right now. But there is something called poison pill that triggers because he has a pending extension that's gonna kick in next July 1st. And what that means is really the difference between these two numbers. And what's happening here is that if the Knicks trade him, then they can calculate their legal return on his salary based on his actual salary, the $10.9 million that he's going to earn this season and that he would have earned with or without that extension. But a receiving team, like the Jazz in this case, when they're calculating what they would have to send out to obtain his salary, they have to use a figure that is the average of the 10.9 he's going to earn this year and the 4 years of his upcoming extension. So that's about a $15.3 million difference that's pretty hard to bridge. To put it another way, the most the Knicks can take back for RJ Barrett is $15.9 million, but the Jazz, in order to acquire this number, would have to send out about 20.8, 20.9. So that's the problem. Is there's no gap, there's no overlap, but there are 4 specific ways that you can address that gap. Probably more than 4. I'm going to talk about 4 in this video. The one way, the easiest way, the one that is most talked about, is just by adding players to either side of the deal. So, for example, we know that the Knicks need multiple salaries to ladder up. They need to send out about $24.2 million on their end to acquire Donovan Mitchell's salary number. You'll see, by the way, Mitchell also has a little bit of this same thing going on where he has 2 different numbers here. That's because of a trade bonus in his contract. A trade bonus counts on the receiving team's end. It does not count for the sending team. But because that trade bonus is capped at this year's maximum salary, the difference isn't huge, and that's going to be something that you could easily work around. But in order for the Knicks to acquire this, we've known all along that they're going to have to send multiple salaries. So let's say they include Fournier. His $18 million means now they're sending out 28.9. They can acquire up to 36, and that's a way to legally acquire Mitchell. But when we add Fournier over here, next to that $26 million Barrett number, which is a fake number, by the way, like fake in the sense that this is just for the sake of determining if it's legal to trade for him. Once he's acquired by the Jazz or any other team, his salary is going to be the 10.9. His cap figure is going to be the 10.9. So this 26 million is just meant to be a little added obstacle in trading for a player in this particular contract situation, but it doesn't mean that the Jazz or anybody else is going to have to pay him that much. But that big fat fake number next to Fournier's 18 means the Jazz have to send out enough salary to acquire 44 million, and Donovan doesn't do it by himself. So now the Jazz have to add salary on their end. They're going to add Gay, which makes it a legal deal for them. But Gay pushes the Knicks about $800,000 too high on their end. So now they can't acquire him without adding some more small salary on their end. And you keep going at this until you find a combination of players that bridges that gap. In the case of Deuce McBride, he makes just enough to bridge that gap for New York, but he doesn't make enough that's going to really be problematic on Utah's side. So now we've constructed a legal deal. So that's one way you can do it's one way you can bridge the poison pill gap, is by adding players to both sides. Another way you can do it, or a way you can complement that strategy, is by using TPEs. The Jazz have two pretty large traded player exceptions. They're essentially credits that they have from earlier deals where they took less money back in trades, and they can use those creatively to get a deal done as well. So they have a 9.7 and a 9.6. They can't combine those, but they can use them to acquire players who fit fully within a trade exception. So let's take McBride off here, and let's pretend that this is Rose now, just to experiment with some different scenarios. So now you see that the Knicks are in a situation where they're not sending out enough money to acquire both Mitchell and Gay. So they would have to include another salary on their side, enough to bridge that gap. Let's say they send someone that we know the Jazz are kind of interested in. Let's say they send Toppin. Now it's a legal trade on the Knicks end because they're sending out almost $8 million. That means they can take 38.5 back, and that accommodates the two salaries that they would be acquiring in this deal. On the Jazz's end, they could actually take Toppin, but instead of taking him into the exception created by Mitchell's and Gay's combined salaries, they could take Toppin into one of those existing TPEs, and then his salary relative to this exception, it's zero. It doesn't count. They'd essentially be taking Barrett and Rose for Mitchell and Gay. They'd be taking Toppin into a separate pre-existing exception because his $5.3 million fits nicely into either of the large TPEs they have remaining. This wouldn't have to be set up as separate deals. It could all be one big happy transaction, but the Jazz get the option when they call in this trade to the league office of telling the league how they're structuring the exceptions on their side of the deal. And so this is another legal way you could bridge the gap. The third way that we are going to talk about is, obviously, you could involve a third team. And the third team that's been mentioned a lot is the Lakers, because the thinking out there is that if the Jazz take Westbrook off the Lakers' hands, he's an expiring $47 million contract. The thinking is if the Jazz acquire Westbrook and give the Jazz a useful player like Bogdanovich, that they could probably extract a pretty good asset or two from the Lakers. So in this scenario, maybe the Jazz take whatever that second big salary is from the Knicks. Maybe they don't take it. Maybe they route that salary to the Lakers as well. I used Rose here instead of Fournier because my understanding, I think the Lakers' priority is around preserving their cap space for next summer. So I think they would prefer the expiring Rose if that's something that the Knicks would do. In this case, the deal doesn't work unless the Jazz also send another salary like Beasley. It doesn't have to be Beasley, but you can see here if they don't send additional salary, then they aren't sending enough to acquire the fake Barrett number and the very real Westbrook number. Although that number will probably come down via buyout and or what they call set off, which is the Jazz will get a break if they release Westbrook and he goes and plays for another team, which is likely. So, it says they have to acquire $73 million. That number's not real by any stretch, but they'd still have to get there, and they can't get there without Beasley or something like Beasley. They could also throw in Gay and Doak and let's say Butler. Gay, Doak, and Butler go to the Lakers, and this is still a legal trade for all three teams. So that's a way that you can use a third team to bridge the gap um, on that type of scenario and make a poison pill trade legal. And each team gets something they want out of that scenario, right? The Lakers get off of let's go back to the Beasley version. They get off of Westbrook. They get Bogey, who would be a great compliment for them. They get Rose and Beasley. Maybe they care about those guys, maybe they don't, but they don't harm next year's cap flexibility. The Knicks get Mitchell. The Jazz get Barrett along with some assets from the Knicks. They also get some assets from the Lakers for taking Westbrook and giving them Bogey. So that's the third way you can bridge the poison pill gap, is by using a third team. But the easiest way, and the way we haven't really talked about, is you could just take the player who is triggering the poison pill provision, take him out of the deal. And all of these deals that we've discussed are a lot easier if there's just no RJ in the deal. And again, I don't know if the Jazz are in love with RJ, if they have to have RJ or not. But if you take RJ out, and that's what this scenario is, then suddenly a deal is much easier to work. So let's stay in the context of a three-team deal with the Lakers. But now, because the Jazz don't have to account for a $26 million salary over here, now they can focus on taking back players that they really care about, which I think in a non-RJ scenario, I think the players they'd be most interested in are Toppin and Grimes. So they would take Westbrook and get some assets from the Lakers. Toppin and they'd take Toppin and Grimes as well. The Knicks get the guy that they've been after. The Lakers get Bogey. Again, they get Rose because he's expiring. They get Reddish, who might be of interest to them. And again, this is a legal deal for everybody because we've taken out the player who was complicating the math and adding a level of complexity to the deal. Same principle applies here if we go back to just Jazz and Knicks dealing directly. With no RJ, this is a much easier deal to construct. The Jazz would still need to acquire a big salary. I have them taking Fournier here. That's probably the easiest way to do it. And then, again, focusing on who are the non-RJ players that they covet the most. I think it's Toppin and Grimes. I'm not 100% sure, but you can see that this deal is well within legal bounds for both teams. And then the Jazz would get some assets as well. So those are, again, there are four ways you can bridge the gap. You can keep adding players back and forth until you have a workable deal. You can do that and add the TPE piece to create a little bit more flexibility. You can, number three, deal with an additional team and reroute some salary that way. Or, as we did on these two, you can just take the player who's triggering the complexity out of the deal altogether. Hopefully that helps. Again, we'll have to see what interests the Jazz, what interests the Knicks, if these two teams are even going to continue to talk to each other. But as far as the question about whether RJ's extension kills this deal, kills this negotiation, the answer is pretty clearly no, unless one or both teams wants it to. There are a lot of ways to get around poison pill and to make a legal trade, even after this extension was signed. And, we'll find out what the two teams have interest in. So thanks. This has been a quick little, not that quick actually, but it turned long. But thanks for joining us for what was supposed to be a quick little video explaining a concept that's going to be important in the next few days here at saltcityhoops.com. Thanks for joining.